Oh, awesome.
There you go. I'll sit on the far side here. So as you get your questions, I'll just ask the first one. But Jeff, I got to start with you just because you're the most recent. Whether or not one agrees with this idea that it's too early to regulate. You talked about the moral panic, widespread irrational fear, then the media comes in and spreads it. Elected officials get involved, provokes regulation. But if you take the word irrational out of that, you get something else, maybe a moral campaign. It leads to anti-smoking laws. It leads to civil rights movement. It leads to new rights for LGBTQ community. Is it wrong for us to feel the outrage we feel about the new media corrupting democracy? Is that what's wrong? Because I understand you think the regulation's wrong, but are we wrong to feel that there is a problem here?
There is a problem, but it's not caused by this new entry. We're simply seeing what our democracy has been on its own. It's taking off the gatekeeper that stood there in media, that gave us a false vision of the world as a neat box that wasn't so neat, and that shows us our ugly sides, yes. And the problem is, it's so wrong to become moralistic about this. If you're going to be moralistic about my speech, yes, you bet your ass it's wrong. I could be worse. We have to learn instead how to listen to people, including what to ignore. We're ignoring too little. If we have a presumption the internet is like a medium, then we expect it to be like the medium, edited and clean and nice and safe, right? The variation on that New Yorker cartoon is I can't go to bed, somebody was wrong on the internet today, right? Now with the regulation, it's I can't go to bed, somebody said shit on the internet, right? I gotta get rid of it. I gotta stop it. And the way to solve this problem is to tamp down the bad. We saw from Josh how hard that is. The clear message of Josh's research at this stage was that it's a fool's errand to try to stop the bad. How do we promote the good? How do we start to agree, some of us at least, on what is good, what is factual, and promote that more and come up with systems that do that more? If your system is trying to shut up somebody you don't agree with, that is inevitably going to lead to bad places.
Questions here. Right here. Tell us your name and your town, please.
I am Sally Smith, and I used to be from Orono and Boothbay, and now I'm from Vermont. I think you've issued a real challenge to this audience, me being over 65. And I am curious, because I have just discovered one of the apps that you can send a story that you like or don't like to and find out if it's fake. I think sharing those apps would be really useful for you guys to do to us.
So thanks very much. And again, I want to just to be very clear, we're doing sort of basic scientific research on trying to understand what's happening here. 87% of people over age 65 in our sample did not share a fake news link. So it's not like everybody was doing this. It's just that it was the ratio of people who are over 65 to millennials in particular, I think, that was so eye-catching in that regard.
So in this room, maybe 5 people shared?
But I do want to say, in terms of interventions, to also offer a word of caution here, which is that we always want to think about the potential unintended consequences of our interventions, and we want to think about the potential to overreact to things that are bright and shiny and in front of us, and especially things that are bright and shiny that are troubling. So Jeff has talked a bit about content moderation. We do work in hate speech in that area. I'm happy to talk more about that if there's future questions. But just on this subject of questions about news and news veracity, right? One of the things I didn't show you at all, because it's really still early research, but I wanted to share some of it with you, was how our professional fact checkers did in coming to agreement on whether a story was false or misleading or not. And the professional fact checkers agree a lot when it's a mainstream news story that's a true news story, but they don't agree all that much when it's coming off one of these junk sites. And even the professional fact checkers, we're getting lots of different answers on some of these questions, right? And again, going back to what I said during the talk about the power law, about all these things where the behaviors are intense in a small group of people, and then they're very, very minor in the vast majority of people, we have to think about the implications of our interventions. So say, for example, so the intervention you've said, it sounds harmless enough and it seems like a very good idea and it's something to get out there. But if what's happening now is we take a whole bunch of people who are maybe encountering one fake news story out of 4,000 they're going to see about the election, or 2 or some small number, and we remind them whenever they see a news story, hey, this news story might actually not be true. You should click on this button to try to figure out when it's true. Maybe that's going to be great. There's some really interesting research out of MIT by David Rand and Pennycook and Gordon Pennycook, where they have looked at nudging people to think about things, and that people, when they pay more attention, they actually are better at figuring out whether stuff is fake or not. They call it kind of the laziness theory of false news. But maybe it's the case that actually, if we constantly remind people there might be false news out there, you have to be worried about false news, that for 90% of the population, this was not actually a big part of their life. It wasn't a big part of their news diet. It wasn't a big part of what they were consuming. But that 90% is getting this treatment, too, of being constantly reminded things could be false. And then when you have politicians that weaponize that and say that anything that makes them look bad or disagrees with their policies or tries to hold them accountable, that's false, right? Maybe people are going to be more susceptible to this. And this is sort of my biggest advice, because Jeff and I are at a lot of these things where people are from civil society groups, and there's always civil society groups that are pitching new types of devices like you're talking about here. Some of them may be good, but we don't know a priori, and these unintended consequences, when you're in a world of power laws, where you're targeting something at what is a narrow sliver of the population, but it's going to get aimed at the whole population. We want to, before we deploy these things, we want to know if we're confident they're doing what they're doing. And we can do research to do this. That's the really, really good news. But I think in terms of the panic and the stampede effect here, we want to be careful that we don't rush to solve problems before we understand the consequences of the types of interventions we're making. And we're working at the Center for Social Media and Politics, we're working, for example, right now on doing some analyses of some of you may have heard of NewsGuard, which lights up a different color. We're trying to do studies right now and picture some of these things. So I think it's a good idea, but I just want to caution about headfirst jumping into these things without understanding the consequences.
Any further comments?
Add to that briefly. Yeah, I mean, I showed you earlier the levels of concern about whether you can tell the difference between what's true and fake. And in most, I think the average is 55%, in many countries 70, 80%. And in many of those countries, it has been where we've seen the media talking about this a lot. So when we ask people in focus groups, have you seen any of these things? Very few people do. The power law comes into play. But they've heard about it on social media, and they're worried about it. And there are legitimate concerns here too. But I think the unintended consequences is an incredibly important thing to bear in mind.
All right, we have a question from a satellite location. Let's take a look. Does anyone check on the bias of fact checkers? Well, you started to answer. That's from Rockland. You might remind people about how you came up with these professional fact checkers.
Yeah, well, I mean, so let's go back to the question and ask for a second, why might we want to crowdsource fact checking, right? Why might the platforms, why are now we have Facebook and Twitter both talking about doing this? And the answer is, well, there's twofold answers, right? One answer is that we don't have enough professional fact checkers in the world. There are whole countries of the world. Like Facebook, we got to remember, we get really focused on Facebook and what it's doing in the United States. But Facebook is in 190 different countries, right? And there are whole countries of the world that don't have professional fact checkers. And we could tell Facebook to go out and pay to train professional fact checkers there, which would be a great thing to do. But that's going to take time. And so if we were to find that kind of crowdsourcing fact checking was an acceptable substitute for this, then that would allow us to employ fact checkers when we need them, right? It would give us more flexibility. But the other question, and this is the other reason is, when this question is getting at this, is that at least in the United States, fact checkers tend to be overwhelmingly of a liberal persuasion, right? And so if Facebook could go to a representative sample of its crowd, or of Facebook users, that would be a great way of addressing this particular question, are the fact checkers potentially biased here? And so that's kind of, I think, why the platforms are interested in it, because it helps solve this problem. What we did in our study, which I mentioned briefly in the beginning there, is that we actually went out to 6 professional fact checkers for every one of these 150 articles. Now, we were this close to going out to only liberal fact checkers because we couldn't find a self-identified conservative fact checker. It's not a profession that seems to attract a lot of, but we found one. We found one at the end. And so actually, in this study, it's 5, and again, it's self-identified. It's 5 self-identified liberals and 1 self-identified conservative fact checker. And I have some slides, and when we do this stuff about how the fact checkers, we are kind of curious to see, like, okay, what if we just take the conservative fact checker? How does that? But our initial implications on that, on the professional fact checkers, seem to be not as bad as one might think it would be. I think the biases in the crowd seem much, much more serious at this point about the liberals not being able to identify liberal fake news, which admittedly is a small portion of the sample, so I don't want to overdo that, and the conservatives not being able to identify the conservative. But it's a legitimate problem and concern. Sorry, I'm looking in the wrong place. It's a legitimate issue, and it's a serious policy issue for the platforms, because to the extent that you're in a country where the professional fact checkers are coming out of a particular political persuasion, it is always going to kind of call this into question. Which brings us back to a larger theme of this conference, which is the professionalization of journalism and the way in which the web has kind of undercut the professionalism of journalism. And we, and other people, many other people who are going to speak the rest of this weekend can speak to this much better than I can. But journalism is a craft, right? It involves finding multiple sources. It involves collaborating. It involves these kinds of things. And so we'd like to think that the fact checkers, if that's their job and they are trained and have this skill set in how to fact check news articles and we got people who worked for newspapers and big newspapers and magazines to do fact checking, that they would have a skill set that would be more impervious to these political biases than when you ask average ordinary citizens to do it, which seems to be a big issue.
All right, a question from the Camden balcony. Tell us your name.
Hi, my name is Cassie Donald. I'm from Stockton Springs, Maine, here with the University of Maine at Farmington. My question is, given the element of subjectivity regarding truth, how do we go about determining what truth really is and filtering it throughout the media?
It's a variant of what we're talking about, but it's a problem for all of us, not the 6 fact checkers that you found.
I can answer that really quick, and then I'll pass it off to the panelists. I can answer it in terms of what we did for our study. Right, there's a huge problem here, because if we want to measure the ability of X group to successfully be fact checkers, so in this case, can we go to ordinary citizens, we need some ground truth that's correct. So for our study, we just said it's the modal response of the professional fact checkers. And we can't do any better than that, because my thought is, well, I could have my grad students double check what the fact checkers did, but then I'm like, why do my grad students know more than professional fact checkers about this? What we are going to do, though, and remember, the one thing about our study, it was designed, because every other study on fact checking has dealt with stuff that's like months old, and there's already Snopes and PolitiFact and all this stuff out there. We wanted to see, because we're interested in the policy implications here of whether you can actually improve the quality of the overall community of news that's available by making short interventions about whether you prioritize things or not in these algorithms. We were looking in the first 24 hours. So what we will ultimately do for ground truth in this study is we're going to go back to professional fact checkers 3 months later. And we'll be able to see, A, the consistency of how the professional fact checkers did in the first 24 hours. But that's the best thing we could come up with for ground truth, is pay the professional fact checkers, let a couple months go by on the stories, and then hopefully we have the total answer. But it's a very thorny question in this. It's a great question.
Nicco?
I don't know. Some parts of it don't seem thorny to me at all. The Pope did not endorse Donald Trump.
Right.
This is the warmest year of the decade, but every year has been the warmest year. The globe is warming. Like, there were some really non-negotiable facts out here. And so the idea that everything is kind of subjective, I completely reject.
So, and just to clarify, I was talking about having an algorithmic rule that we could use in our lab for what's the correct answer to these questions. And I have a longer talk on this with slides, a lot of slides that have, some of the articles are tough. I mean, some of them are really kind of tough to take. But yes, I don't want to be saying there is objective truth and there's not objective truth. I was just talking about this was the best rule we could come up with, exactly because of what Nicco's saying, that I think on these objective truth things, the modal answer from professional fact checkers is going to do a very good job.
I think the problem is that ordinary people just need a proxy for that. They need a simple way of sorting this out. They haven't got the time to do all this stuff, and which is why, going back to the points we made earlier about the importance of brand and the importance of finding some shortcuts to what people can believe and what people can't believe.
But yes, if truth were easy, we wouldn't need thousands of journalists to get it. The problem is, I think that we have to go a little bit deeper into the psychological work that you're going to embark upon. Dana Boyd, a brilliant researcher in New York at Data and Society, look up her work, argues that we are in an epistemological war, where if I hate Josh, then I'm gonna hate his facts, and it doesn't matter, right? Kellyanne Conway, God help us, was right. There are alternate facts in this epistemological war. And so we've got to figure out how to grapple with that. We all know people who are disagreeing with what any sane person would think is rational, but something is happening in our brains in neuroscience that is making people go toward that thing. Why are we white people angry? We don't have any damn right to be angry. We've been terribly privileged. But there's some reason that old white men are being angry. Well, I'm not saying we have to empathize with that or coddle that, but if we have any hope of treating it, we might have to act more like psychologists and psychiatrists than journalists.
So I want to just offer maybe a different perspective of sorts, which is that when I think about the framers of the Constitution, they understood that there was like a natural tension between the monarch and the mob, right? That you didn't actually want either side to have too much power.
Oh, I hate that idea of the mob.
But
just as bad as the mass.
I, for one, don't want the decisions of this country to be made by the mass. The whole idea of the republic and things like the U.S. Senate is to try and offer some buffer, right, between the mass and power.
But to presume that the world out there is a mass, that all these people here are all the same, is the going in wrong assumption. And what we don't have, now that we finally have systems to hear people as individuals, we have to learn how to do that. Right? Living while black was a huge education to me as a white man in America, where not an education to anybody who's black to realize that the risk that they were under when they went shopping and went to lunch and went into their own homes, and only because the victims of this and the witnesses to it could now share that around the gatekeepers, around my colleagues in journalism and media, could I finally learn that. And so the systems are set up since Gutenberg, around this idea, or since 1814, of the mob and the mass. That's the idea we got to get rid of. And we've got to figure out democracy as the representation of lots of people and lots of voices.
And also, just since it was brought up, as the comparativist on this panel who's done research around the world, the Senate is one of the least proportionate, is one of the most disproportionate legislative bodies in the world.
Right.
Right. We are, and it's going to become an increasingly huge problem in U.S. politics because, I mean, we are in a situation where in California there are 2 senators for 38 million people, and there's 2 senators for 300,000 people in Wyoming. And as we head towards a situation, as politics has gotten sorted in this country more geographically than it was previously, and you don't have Democrats who are winning Senate seats in the Dakotas anymore and some of these situations, the numbers I'm seeing is that we're headed within not too many years to situations where 50% of the Senate will represent 30% of the population of the United States. And so I think in terms of, I think this is just a warning flag.
But that's just a process problem in a sense. You could solve that by changing some of the rules about allocation in the Senate. My point is that the Senate and other parts of the government, like Supreme Court, were set up to basically provide a firewall between, I'm sorry, Jeff, the mob who maybe think global warming isn't real and nothing we can say will convince them otherwise, the mob who maybe think Russians are not interfering in our elections and nothing we can say will convince them otherwise. Like, I'm not sure that, like in this, the epistemological war is a long one. That's not actually new. That's history. And what I think of as the ideas in like the Federalist Papers and the ideas that were grappled with in the founding of this country was trying to figure out some way to navigate that war that would lead to really good public policy.
Let's move on. Question here in the hall. Tell us your name, sir.
John Gilmore, summer resident of Rockport. In the late 19th century, there were these big monopolies that developed, and we passed antitrust laws and broke up the big companies. Then along we go to the 90s, and the internet comes, touted as this great democratic development. And in about 5 years, four or five companies completely dominate the internet worldwide. And I'm wondering whether we should be trying to come up with new antitrust laws and break up Facebook, which also controls Instagram, Google, Microsoft, and Apple totally control everything, and it's not very democratic, and you don't have any choice.
I thought you were going to talk about MySpace and Yahoo and Microsoft
AOL.
and AOL. It's early. It's changing, and I think a lot of this instinct to break them up is an instinct of anger, an instinct of fear of the big. But I don't think it accomplishes anything. You break up Facebook and Instagram, each is still huge, and so I think the question is what is rational. I point to Kathleen because she's supporting this kind of discussion transatlantically. What do we learn about the regulation that's already occurred? What do we learn about the effect of that? We need data, we need research. Part of the French regulatory effort is to say that they will be required to provide data so we can know what their impact is. And then we can make smarter decisions. But right now, I think this discussion of break them up is an angry mob.
But by the way, John is not asking a theoretical question. It's happening right now, supported by elements on the left and elements on the right.
Yep.
I wanted to ask Jeff a question about this that I genuinely don't know what to think, which is, do you think there is something about the nature of these large technology platforms that is substantively different from big corporations in the past? Because if there's something substantively different, then we do need to try and imagine different ways of treating them.
I think it's too soon to know, and we thought that about all kinds of companies in the past, right? We thought that about the Telegraph. We thought that about others. The question is, part of the problem here is that we are taking ourselves off the hook, and we're blaming the companies for the things that we do on them, the platforms of what we do on them. And our problem is not with the technology companies, it's with us, right? The trolls are not, the others bots, fine. But the trolls are human beings. That's who we have a problem with. And how we control that, this notion of control scares me when it comes to speech. I'm that American that the First Amendment is dear to my heart in that way. And I think we're smart enough in the long run to figure it out. We figured out print, we figured out the Telegraph, we figured out all these moral panics that came before. And so no, I don't think that they are necessarily fundamentally different. The time is different, and we're in, I think, a new era. Eras all being meaningless, but a new era. And so that's different, but I don't think these companies necessarily are.
I think it's that. I mean, the question is, what's the problem we're trying to solve? So rather than starting with let's break them up, what will that achieve, to Jeff's point? But also, as with all this stuff, there's positives of big, large, and negatives from a consumer's point of view. I mean, some of the most trusted companies, if you look at trust levels, Amazon, Google, Facebook, even Facebook, are actually maybe not Facebook, but the others are more trusted than the average news provider, for example. Yes. And the advantage of scale, Microsoft dominating Word, for example, really helped people have the same view of word processing and help to advance things rather than lots of different types of things that work slightly differently. Google, most people are using Google, and if you ask them what they think of that service, they think it's broadly fantastic at a consumer level. So I think this is a complicated question, and we need to think again about unintended consequences, and we need to really understand what problem it is we're trying to solve with breaking up.
Yeah, and I just want to give a shout out for a second. If you're interested in this topic, so the Stigler Center at the University of Chicago Booth School had a big conference about this and then commissioned white papers, and there were 4 different committees, one on media, one on economic competition, one on privacy, one on politics. I was part of the politics subcommittee. So there's a 335-page report with good executive summaries of it as well. But you can take a look at it. And so the short answer is what's great about this is that people are really thinking about this particular question. But I do want to try to get at Nicco's point about like what's different. And I think from an antitrust perspective, and I'm the farthest thing from an antitrust lawyer, but this is what I learned participating in this conference and in this white paper, is that the internet, these monopoly companies like Google and Facebook, which it was striking when Nick's thing was up there and he was listing all the top of everything, and they were all Facebook companies, right? Like Facebook is Instagram, Facebook is WhatsApp, Facebook is Messenger. There's a top 4 on one of those. But the traditional arguments about antitrust is that you get monopoly power and then you do 2 bad things that cause harm to society. One is you raise prices, and the second is you stop improving the product. And I think what's throwing people for a loop here is that with these social media, with these platforms, they're free. Other than LinkedIn, they don't have any prices, and they're not there's certainly, you can make a million criticisms of the platform, but to claim that they're not innovating is not one of them. In fact, people get way more mad at Facebook every time they roll out some new innovation because it doesn't look like what it did last month. And then the final thing that I want to just say about this point about the antitrust, because in the antitrust conversation, as best I understand it, it's about unwinding Instagram and WhatsApp from Facebook, and it's about unwinding YouTube from Google. And the point I just want to make about that is that a lot of the things that people are concerned about here in this room, everything surrounding content moderation, breaking up into these other huge platforms is not going to have any effect on that. The stuff that I was talking about earlier today about making sure that people have access to data will probably even be harder if you have more stakeholders that you have to negotiate with, but more it's just orthogonal. It's not going to solve any of those problems. So I think very much like what Nick was saying, I think we want to make sure that as we move towards these steps, that we keep the policymakers focused on what's the goal of doing this and how will these steps lead to that.
I mean, the platforms are free to consumer end users, but they're not free to businesses big and small. And so there's an interesting innovative thinking at
totally.
Among antitrust regulators.
Totally, on the consumer side, you're absolutely
picking
right.
winners and losers and stuff.
Free in the sense they're harvesting your personal data. I mean,
Well, that's a good point.
I was in trouble by the New York Times article recently, where they know what church you go to, they follow you into the corner store, and you don't have any choice. You know, if you want to participate in the internet, you immediately are granting these monopoly companies your private data, and they monitor where you go and what you do, and then they use it for political purposes.
Yeah, interesting.
And that's exactly what people are talking about in these conversations. But I'm just saying that from a traditional legal framework, it doesn't fit into the normal model of raising the prices. That's all I was saying. But I agree with exactly what your point.
Yeah, I mean, I'm torn. On the one hand, I actually agree with Jeff. It's just too early to to really settle on specific policy solutions. On the other hand, I believe profoundly you must hold power accountable. Power corrupts. And they have too much power, and they're not held accountable. And so that's
about how you do it, right?
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
about how,
what problem you're trying to solve.
Understanding the problems you're trying to solve, breaking it down, and having responses, and maybe iterating those responses, because the first thing you think of is probably going to be wrong.
What's also changed is our attitude. I'm old enough to remember phone books.
What are those?
Yeah, what are those? Let's go to a satellite location. Got a question here. Isn't privacy a modern concept? That's from Hanover, New Hampshire. Who wants to talk about that?
I wrote a book that no one bought because it was optimistic, called Public Parts.
Public Parts?
Public Parts,
That's
yes.
good.
Yeah, wasn't bad. Yeah. I also I dedicated it to Howard Stern too. So it's with my mother, and he was mad about that. But yes, privacy.
What was she?
Exactly.
Not that she was included, because anyway. Yes, it is a modern concept, right? It's the hallway was considered a technological invention. The idea of a private room was something that was new at a point in society. But we did invent it, and we invented it for a reason, and we want it. So it needs protection. But so does publicness. So does sharing. You know, when we talk about the data that matters, imagine health data. I'm part of the World Trade Center health program because I was there that day, and so far I have 2 cancers as a result. Now, I've shared that publicly and told you all about it, including prostate cancer, so you all now know my penis doesn't work very well. Well, how's that for being public? So why would I do that? Am I not insane? Because there's a societal benefit to that sharing. Because that data about me is telling people what the toxins that day did to people, literally. And sharing that data matters. So yes, privacy matters. Privacy is important. The most important lesson of privacy is, if you want to keep it in your head, don't say it to anybody. Once I share with Josh, it's out of my hands. It's now in his hands. He has a responsibility to me. So publicness is an obligation to society. Privacy is an obligation to someone else whose stuff you know. And so we need to figure this out. We need to negotiate this. But yes, let's keep in mind that it's not a forever. That there was a point in society when we saw the benefit of the village and the benefit of sharing and the benefit of connecting. And we've lost too much of that. And I fear we're all going to become turtles.
And we are heading towards a point where it will be much easier for researchers to access your private medical information to do studies than it will be data that's available on social media platforms. And we should think about a society if that's the right set of priorities that we should have.
I would just note in the wake of the caucuses and tonight's Nevada, of course, the idea of the secret ballot is actually pretty new in American history. You know, we didn't even really think voting should be private until pretty recently.
There's a question here in Camden. Sir, tell us your name.
Al Altshuler from Cumberland, Maine. Well, Mill and Milton and Justice Holmes and Justice Brandeis told us that the test of truth was a free marketplace of ideas, and we could tolerate all kinds of falsehoods as long as truth was able to speak, and we would get. It's a wonderful idea. It's a beautiful idea. All of us would like to believe it. Vladimir Putin doesn't believe it. He says, those guys, I'm going to put a lot of stuff out there favoring Trump and a lot of stuff favoring Bernie, and the Americans are going to go at each other and tear themselves apart, and Russia will surge forward. What he's putting out is false because it pretends to be from Americans. But Americans are doing exactly the same thing. All Russia is doing is amplifying it a little bit. So I guess my question is, are you sure that Putin is wrong? I mean, we've heard evidence of how bad people are at discovering truth. And if you are sure he's wrong, what would you do about Russian interference in our elections? Would you legalize it as long as it consists of speech?
In the group that I'm part of, one thing we all agree about is foreign interference in elections is a line. So no. The speech is allowed, but if they buy ads, commercial, if they do specific things, we have laws about that. So that was the line we drew.
So here, this is a fun argument.
Oh, the glee on your face.
And you know I love you.
We'll hug soon.
I basically think the First Amendment is obsolete, right? I'm in the Tim Wu camp. The First Amendment comes out of a time when it was so hard to publish things that you had to, it was scarce, you had to protect it. But now, the truth gets drowned out in an ocean of crap.
You sound very Chinese, my friend. You sound very Chinese right now.
I was raised in Asia. And so I'm like, I guess I'm unconvinced that the priority here is keeping it totally open. I think that what we have to focus on is privileging, not that we have to ban anything, but finding ways of making the truth louder, privileging certain.
Who decides that truth? Who decides that privilege? The discussion yesterday about certifying journalists, sorry, but I'm way against that.
Yeah.
Because what's given can be taken away. At some point, the real problem, core problem to me is not media, it's education. The fact that we don't respect education in this country, and that the majority of people who are not educated are the ones who believe in this shit. Let's go to the core problem before we think we have an easy solution. If we end up being too scared of Putin, he does win because we end up acting Putin-esque or we act Chinese.
Yeah, I don't think that the issue about whether or not we should block foreigners pretending to be whether we should go to Facebook and say, hey, if this is a Russian government agent who's pretending to be an American, you should shut the account down. I think that's over. Like, everybody agrees. I think the actual danger it's kind of what you're hinting at here, is that becomes a red herring, because it's precisely so easy to wrap our heads around agreement on it, right? That we can all agree that if someone is a Navy is living in St. Petersburg, pretending to be a Navy SEAL, spouting a whole bunch of disinformation, but pretending to be a Navy SEAL in Tennessee, posting this disinformation, yeah, you can turn that account off. Like, no one's really going to defend that and say, oh no, Facebook should respect Russia's government's rights to pretend to be somebody else explaining and these kinds of things. What's complicated is when it is a Navy SEAL in Tennessee who's sprouting all sorts of stuff. What do you do about this? And I actually think that the lasting legacy of the Russian interference in the 2016 election campaign is not so much a blueprint for foreign interference in election campaigns that, that'll continue to happen. We can argue about how much it mattered or not. I think we'll hear more about that, we'll hear more about that later on in the discussion. But the lasting legacy was it was a toolkit that combined amplification and pitting forces against each other. And it was a sort of recipe book of things that you could do. And I remember being asked by a reporter shortly after the US election about whether I thought the Russians were going to interfere in the Mexican elections. And I said, I don't know. I have no idea whether the Russians are going to interfere in the Mexican elections, but I know who is going to want to interfere in the Mexican election, which is Mexicans, right? And so this is a toolkit now that can be used by domestic actors. And that leads to all these kind of much more thornier questions that we're debating here. And people fall is being used, absolutely. And I think that's the much bigger issue about this. And some of us fall on different sides of this issue in terms of where you fall on this. But I think that's the harder question here. And I think that's what we're going to be wrestling with moving forward.
The big question is also transparency around this, the extent to which we can see and understand what's going on. So everything's been thrown up into the air, and we need some kind of rules, particularly around elections. So anything goes on the internet, but on television or radio, we have different rules. So we need to standardize this in some way, particularly around election time, so we can see more of what's going on, so that we can see into making sure that we understand that the platforms are doing what they say they're going to do, and that we have some way of looking at that. And I think that's kind of where we'll end up. But we haven't made up these new rules. We haven't got that consensus. We haven't worked out how to harmonize what we do on television, radio, print, and in online.
But let me just give you a sense of how complicated this is, because I think if we're going to push past the Russia example that I just gave a second ago, the next thing that falls out of that is transparency. You should be clear about who you are, right? So now the platforms are wrestling with the question, well, what if you are in New York pretending to be if you're in Florida? Or what if you're a white male in upstate New York pretending to be an African-American woman in Florida who's urging African-American women not to vote for the Democratic candidate and that they should just stay home on election day because both the parties are horrible for African-Americans? Is that speech that you can begin to shut down? And that then leads you into the question of anonymity, right? And do you want to go to a world where everyone has to identify who they are online transparently and accurately, which seems kind of normatively pleasing, right? To think about that as it's something we can sort of wrap our heads around. But then again, Facebook's everywhere in the world, right? And so are you going to say the standard is you don't get to participate in the online conversation unless you publicly identify yourself ahead of time? You know who would love that? The Iranian government, right? The Saudi government would love that. And so that's what makes these, super complicated questions. And to make it even worse, we know that people who are anonymous online behave worse. So what Kevin Munger, who's now an assistant professor at Penn State, but was a PhD student in my lab, who did this really super interesting study where he created these Twitter bots to tell people to behave better online. And did these interesting experiments with it. But one of the things he found was that when he was doing this partisan treatment, people who were anonymous online, when the Twitter bots told them to behave better, they behaved worse, right? People who were themselves actually were behaving better. So it's really complicated. I don't know what the correct answer to it is, because anonymous people on the internet behave badly. But go back to my thing in the beginning, liberation technology. If we say no anonymous people on the internet, what does that mean for democratization movements around the world?
And identity is a sign of privilege, including in this country. And we have to be aware that the systems we create, if we create them from a position of privilege, then who are we leaving out?
Yeah, I just wish even the Russian propaganda stuff were as clear as we were saying. Did you just see? There's 2 terrestrial radio stations in, I think, Kansas City, Radio Sputnik. They are Russian propaganda beaming right on your radio dial. And it's First Amendment, whatever.
What's wrong with Kansas?
Yeah, exactly. We have run out of time. I apologize. I need you back in your seats if you could at 1:10. We're going to start at the stroke of 1:15. We got a lot of really cool stuff. Philippines, Mexico, Iran. You won't want to miss one of the videos that's been selected by the conference producer, Jim Ruddy. And if you have time following lunch, please swing by. It's called the Tucker Room, where there's a great selection of books, including those by our speakers, are on display. And if you need a recommendation for a restaurant for lunch in Camden, Opera House box office has got a nice list. Thank you. Thank you.